Welcome back to the Personal Finance Project. Today we are doing another installment of the book club. And this particular episode is actually going to be installment 7, not the 7th book club episode, but the 7th installment of the series we've been working our way through on this book by Christine Benz called How to Retire. And she collected the wisdom of 20 or so practitioners, writers, speakers, and others about their thoughts on how you can retire. And so the lesson today is from Maria Bruno, and it is titled Focus on What You Can Control. And the quote that Christine provides here is, when I asked Maria what lesson she'd like to discuss for the book, she said she'd like to talk about how retirees can maintain a sense of control even as they're contending with many open-ended variables. And weirdly enough, to begin, we're actually going to take a quick trip into a different book, which I love. It's by a man by the name of Richard Wiseman. He wrote this book called 59 Seconds. He wrote another book called Quirkology, and he wrote a third book called The Luck Factor, and also another book called The As-If Principle. All of them are wonderful. I've read them many times. I cannot believe I haven't discussed this guy until just now, but we're going to take a dive here really quickly into a book he wrote called 59 Seconds, or it was published under another name. You might have seen it called Rip It Up. Both of those are the same book. And this is going to tie really nicely into what we're going to discuss today about focusing on what you can control. So he opens this book. Do you want to improve an important aspect of your life? Perhaps lose weight, find your perfect partner, obtain your dream job, or simply be happier? Try this simple exercise. Close your eyes and imagine the new you. Think of how great you would look in those close-fitting designer jeans, dating Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie. This book was written some time ago. Sitting in a luxurious leather chair at the top of a corporate ladder, or sipping a pina colada as the warm waves of the Caribbean gently lap at your feet. The good news is that this type of exercise has been recommended by some of the experts in the self-help industry for years. The bad news is that a large body of research now suggests that such exercises are at best ineffective and at worst harmful. Although imagining your perfect self may make you feel better, engaging in such mental escapism can also have the unfortunate side effect of leaving you unprepared for the difficulties that crop up on the rocky road to success, thus increasing the chances of you faltering at the first hurdle rather than persisting in the face of failure. Fantasizing about heaven on earth may put a smile on your face, but it is unlikely to help transform your dreams into reality. And so this really ties in with the focus on the things that you can control, because the reason that Scott and I put out this podcast, the reason that producer Kira and Hannah are working so diligently on this podcast isn't just because we like the sounds of our own voices or that they like the sounds of our voices. I assure you that's not the case. It's because we actually want this information to change the way that you manage your finances so that you can enrich your life. But the only way that this information will help you is if you actually take it and apply it in your life. So later in this opening chapter, Richard sits down with a young woman by the name of Sophie. And Sophie says she wants to improve her life. There's all these things that she wants to improve about her life, but she's not doing anything. And so the premise of the book, 59 Seconds, is the advice that he gave her could be implemented in less than a minute, thus the 59 seconds. And that's true, too, of a lot of the information that Scott and I are going to convey to you, the listener or the viewer. There's a lot of stuff we go over here that sounds very academic or theoretical, but it is only going to actually help you improve your financial position in life if you do it. And so focusing on what you can control, another way of saying that is, what is it in our financial lives that we can actually do something about? Okay, and that's really the basis of this chapter. So let's get into it. The first sort of heading that they're going to go over is called the value of focusing on what you can control. So Christine says, let's talk about why you think it's so important and empowering to focus on what you can control and tune out the things that you can't. What benefits does that bring? And so Maria says, as you're getting closer to retirement or making the transition, it's especially valuable to focus on what you can control because the stakes are high. For example, during your working years, you have a salary as a lever. But when you retire and you're tasked with managing this large nest egg through your retirement, that can feel overwhelming. It can cause some people to be too scared to do any real planning, or others might obsess over things that simply do not matter in the long run. And the note that I made to myself there about things that are trivial things that tend not to matter in the long run are going to be the performance of single stocks, where interest rates might be 6 months from now, who is in the White House, what the prevailing tax rates are at the time of this listening, what the market might do over the next 90 days. These are all things over which you can exert virtually no control. You can't control exactly what a corporate officer is going to do. You can't control who's going to get caught on a kiss cam at a Coldplay concert. These things are things that exist out in the universe over which you can exert very little control. But unfortunately, many retirees spend an inordinate amount of time ruminating on such things, and it isn't helpful. And so what Maria is saying is you really want to divorce yourself from thinking about those things and instead focus your efforts on the things over which you can actually exert some control. So she goes on. Well, she reiterates, there are clearly some things you can't control, but it's important to know which ones that you can control. Having a plan going into retirement means that you're probably going to be able to withstand different events that happen along the way. That leads to better financial outcomes, and it also leads to more confidence and hopefully enjoyment as well as peace of mind. And I made a note to myself there saying on that peace of mind a bit of information, or that her opinion, that's really the whole point. And so there was this thing going around on the internet for a while that said, here's the deal. You can get $50 million today, but there will be a snail out in the world that is hell-bent on your destruction. And if this snail finds you, you will die a painful death. Would you take that deal? And so some of us in the office were talking about how if they took the deal, they would construct ever more contrived series of snail traps and security and all this stuff to keep this deadly snail away from them. And I thought about it for a minute. I said, I wouldn't take the deal. And they thought, well, why is that? I said, well, because I think the point of having that much money is peace of mind, is basically absolving yourself from all of the worries that a human being could have, and money can, to a certain degree, do that. However, if the money comes with this one specific contingency that you are constantly going to be worried about encountering a vicious snail, then it isn't worth it, that there is no price beyond which I would be willing to take that deal. So there are a lot of vicious snails in personal financial planning. There are the markets, interest rates, elections, taxes. All of these things are out there. And unfortunately, no amount of money can really absolve you from their worry, and you wouldn't take a deal like that. But what can help you is having a sensible plan so that when these things that you cannot control happen, you're not totally thrown through a loop. And that is really what Maria is getting at there. So Christine then follows up and says, what things should people take off the table because they can't control them? Not to pick on CNBC or really any other financial outlet, but if you're watching financial news, you see a ton of things over which you have no control. And so Maria says there are two categories in particular that you should try to tune out as you're heading into retirement. The first would be the markets and the noise that goes along with them. That's basically everything that we've discussed up to this point. Markets, interest rates, taxes, elections, all the rest of that. And then the other one, she says, is the other key thing you can't control is your own life expectancy. Now, this is a little bit of a callback to what Bill Perkins said when you enter retirement about trying to get a good sense of how long you might live so that you can come up with a more sensible strategy for spending your money over that period. Now, life insurance companies and the actuaries that are employed there are pretty damn good at figuring out just how long it is you're going to live. That's how they assess what you would pay in a premium if you had a life insurance policy. Genetics, working closely with your physician, how long your parents have lived, those things are going to give you a good indication. But what Maria is saying here is you shouldn't be so stressed out about this to where it paralyzes you. There's no sense in worrying too much about exactly how long you're going to live because that information is not really pertinent to how you're going to spend your time today, unless, of course, you think you're going to die tomorrow. And for most people listening to this podcast, I doubt that that is the case. So rather than stressing about how long you're going to live, she says you should construct a plan that is very conservative in its estimation of your life expectancy. And the planning that we do here, we plan out for people to live well into their 90s, well beyond life expectancy, but it is a plan that will accommodate a lot of market shocks along the way and which will tend to preclude what we call longevity risk, which is the risk of running out of money. And that risk of running out of money is a real risk for retirees, and it's one they actually fear more than death. And so Maria says no one wants to run out of money during retirement or be a burden for their loved ones when it comes to long-term care. But there's also a flip side to that. If you pass away prematurely, there's a risk that you'll have underspent and didn't fully enjoy the fruits of your labors during your lifetime because you were so worried about running out of money. You need to plan for both scenarios, and that can be really difficult. And this is something that I think there's a good analogy to people trying to lose weight. People think that they can adhere to a fat loss diet indefinitely, But if you think about it, a fat loss diet is supposed to be only for a short period of time because ultimately you would starve. You cannot maintain a fat loss diet perpetually. It's not possible. And the same could be said of a withdrawal rate in retirement. A lot of people really concern themselves about a withdrawal rate that is sustainable. But my question to them would be, what do you mean by that? Because remember, every person who has been born has also died. Not all just yet, but every person that is born will die. And so your retirement is going to come to an end. It's a bit of a macabre fact, but it is absolutely unimpeachably true. And so your spending policy does not necessarily mean it should be sustainable in perpetuity, unless you plan on leaving a big trust to your children and your grandchildren and all the rest. And there are some people who want to do that. But you need a policy that can sustain spending for maybe 25 or 30 years. And that will not be the same as a policy that could sustain spending forever. So the classic 4% rule, that is born out of a spending policy when adjusted for inflation that is very likely to leave a retiree with an adequate sum of money at the end of their life. It's not an amortization policy. And so I think what she's getting out there is, if you are under the impression that you might live for a very long time and that at some point along the way you might encounter some very costly long-term care expenses, you are going to paralyze yourself into just underspending. And from Scott and I's perspective, when we're sitting across from a client, underspending and leaving an estate larger than the total dollars you withdrew from it over your retirement is a failure. Now, it's not quite as devastating as running out of money early, and we definitely appreciate that. But we are of the opinion that you should be able to spend the money you have so diligently earned and saved, not just continue to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate so that somebody else can live the life that you just occasionally thought about. Okay? So that was sort of the first section, control what you can control. The next section is going to be get a vision for your retirement. And, repeat listeners are going to, there's some callbacks to earlier chapters in this book from this section. So Christine says, let's talk about the factors that retirees should focus their energies on because they can exert some level of control over them. And Maria says, at the top of the list is having goals and achieving a vision for what you want your retirement to look like, starting with lifestyle. Stop and think about what you want to do in retirement. After all, it is your retirement and not someone else's. And so we had heard before about how, I think it was Michael Finke or Fink, I'm not exactly sure how he pronounces his name, talking with a retiree and how they're saying, well, I want to play golf and I want to travel and I want to do one other thing. It's like, well, you've described 3 of 365 days of 1 year of your 30-year retirement. That's not good enough. You really need to have a better sense of what your daily rhythms are going to look like in retirement, because that is what you will actually be doing. You have to be doing something. You have to be spending your time on something. And if you leave that to chance, it's very likely you're going to be spending your time on things that you just don't find to be that fulfilling. So having a vision for what you want your retirement to actually look like in terms of the things you will literally be doing is extremely important. So she goes on. She says, do you want to travel? Do you want to spend time with your grandkids? Do you want to work part-time or volunteer? It's important to start thinking about those things in retirement, those in retirement priorities before you make the transition. Talk to people who already retired. And this is another callback to having a surrogate. Scott and I talked about this for mistakes people make when they're young, is they endeavor upon going to medical school or to law school without having spoken to a practicing physician or lawyer and asking them very direct questions about what their day-to-day life is actually like. If you are thinking about embarking on your retirement, ask somebody who has retired before you, what is it that you're doing? What's working? What's not working? What has been easy to do? What's travel like? What are some tips or tricks that you've developed over time so that you can learn the best of what everybody else has already figured out and not make the same mistakes they've made? So that's super important. And then she says, people love talking about the retirements, how they made that choice, and what they do with their time now. So people are very willing to talk to you about these things. Write down your goals and then go back and review them periodically. And then she goes on to talk about, if you are married, how it's very important to be making these decisions with your spouse. And I made a note to myself because, and data on this is always a little bit tricky, but the fastest growing group of people who are getting divorced are those who are over the age of 60. So that does not mean that most divorces happen for people who are beyond the age of 60. Let's just differentiate that very quickly here. it means that more and more people are getting divorced after 60, and that group is growing rapidly. So it's possible that in the future they will overcome some of their younger contemporaries, but that's not where they're at now. And I thought about it, and it kind of makes sense. The baby boomer generation is of full retirement age, and they are a large segment of the population, and many of them are entering retirement after having worked a 30 or 40-year career. And for many men and women, their sense of status or place in a hierarchy came exclusively from work. And now that they have lost that status, they might not have a good sense of who they are without work. And if they don't have a good sense of who they are without work, how could they expect their spouse to have a good sense of who they are without work? And I could see how that could lend itself to some very difficult, or as my wife and I call it, moments of intense fellowship in a marriage. And so she says it's very important that your spouse is on board. I second that. So find a surrogate, get your spouse on board, develop a vision for what you want to do in retirement. And then Christine says, is it helpful to think about retirement as a series of different phases? If someone is in their mid-60s, for example, and they're active and feeling great, they can think about those first 10 or 15 years as a go-go period. But should they also plan for the next phase when they might slow down a bit and even a phase after that? And this is a really great question. And in fact, in our initial planning meeting, we do divide your retirement into essentially 3, sometimes 2 distinct phases. You have the go-go phase. That tends to be day 1 to retirement out until about 75 or 80, kind of depending on how healthy you are when you enter your retirement, how long your parents have lived, and a number of other factors. And then you might have the slow-go period, and that could be from 80 to 85, maybe 75 to 85, where you're slowing down some, but you're not confined yet. You're not thinking about a retirement home. You're not thinking about aging in place, putting handles everywhere in your home. You can still do some things. And then the last phase is the no-go phase. And that really is where maybe you are thinking about assisted living. Maybe you do have slightly more needs for your health care. Maybe you really do just want to stay very close to your family and not travel very much. And I think it is helpful for people to think about those 3 phases. But I do want to have one word of caution. I think it's easy to project yourself forward in time and think that your tastes and preferences might change and that you feel like it will be a loss, where you might really still desire to do some things that you can no longer do. And that does happen to some people. You do have people who have major health events earlier than they would like, and they are no longer able to do some of the things they want to do. That can be tragic. But for most people, this change happens kind of organically over time, where you might discover that your preferences have evolved with your capacity. So by the time you're 80 or 85, you might prefer legitimately and sincerely to stay home and to do things closer to home and not travel any longer. Not necessarily just because you feel like you're not capable of doing so. You might still feel perfectly capable of doing so. You just might not want to do it. So it's kind of like developing an affinity for coffee as you get older. When you're younger, it's so bitter, you can't hardly conceive of a person drinking this on purpose. And then as you get older, you kind of like that taste. You develop an affinity for it. So it is important to think about retirement in 3 phases, but I don't necessarily want people to think, in phase 1, I've got to really cram in all this stuff because I'm going to really want to have done all of it. I think it's important to do the things you want to do in that phase, but not because you think you're going to lose your ability to do it and you're going to see it as a loss. Some of this stuff happens organically. Maria says, that's a great approach because otherwise it can feel a little overwhelming. If you're planning for 30 years of retirement, of course, you can't quite predict how things will unfold later in life, but you're probably going to have more clarity about your goals for the next 5 or 10 years. Totally agree. You're going to have a good sense of what your tastes and preferences are going to be near term than much longer term. Okay, and this is the callback. Christine says, we've heard from a few people over the course of these interviews that having a purpose in retirement is really important. Michael Finke made the point that it's probably not helpful to embark on retirement with the idea that it's going to be a very long vacation. Though that might sound appealing while you're working, how can people connect with a purpose in retirement? And the note that I made myself was my wife and I were actually just out for her birthday. And we were in a store, and the clerk working at the store said that he and his wife were expecting their first child, and that he was a little bit nervous about how the dynamic of their relationship might change as a consequence of having a baby. We prefaced our later remarks by saying it is going to change. Your life is in for a significant change, and the baby is going to impose, if you will, on the relationship that you had with your spouse. But what I pointed out to him was, look, when you have no other responsibilities outside from to yourself, to your work, and to your spouse, then dating your wife, it's still fun. Don't get me wrong, but it's just you're dating, you're going to something. You're going out to a nice restaurant or to a nice movie, but what you're going from isn't necessarily that difficult. And so what I pointed out to him now is a date for my wife and I is if we are out of the house while someone else puts our kids to bed. That is a date. We could be having teeth pulled. We could be doing anything during that time, and we would regard that as time well spent. It's a great date. So you are, now that you have a child, yes, your life is probably more difficult. I think it's been enriched immeasurably, but you are now going on dates from something. You are shedding a responsibility, if just for a few hours, so that you are going on a date from something. And that will enrich the date to a degree that you cannot really describe until you've actually done it yourself. And the guy was like, I had never thought of it in that way. And that's a really good way to think about retirement too, is saying, yeah, this notion of, oh, it's going to be a very long vacation, that's great, but that's not enough. It's not enough to get you through a 30-year period. And so you are retiring from something. In many of our clients' cases, they're retiring from a very difficult and very demanding job. But even then, that only lasts a couple of years. There was a story that the senior partner, Richard, likes to tell about 3 years into retirement. One of our clients looked over at his wife and said, I am finally totally relaxed. And she was like, what are you talking about? You've been retired for 3 years. He's like, yeah, but when I was working every Sunday night, my mind would be running a mile a minute thinking about all the things I would have to attend to the next morning, which would be Monday morning. And he's like, I'm finally sitting here with you on a Sunday evening watching television, and I am not thinking about the things that I might have to do tomorrow. And that is a wonderful place to be. And if, and only if, he's got other really purpose-driven things that he is doing in lieu of attending to those fires at work. So retiring from something, pretty easy for people to conceptualize, but what is it that you are retiring to? Maria is essentially seconding what Michael said here is you've got to have some purpose in retirement. You've got to have a reason to be getting up in the morning. Hobbies, other pursuits, consulting work, whatever it is going to be for you, you've got to make sure that you've thought about these things ahead of when you enter your retirement. So one of the next things that they talk about is thinking through where you're going to live in retirement. And that is extremely important. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it here because a lot of people have a pretty good sense of where they're going to be living in retirement. They might entertain moving to be closer to their children. And if that is very important to you, I would argue that getting that decision made well in advance of when it needs to be made is going to be far better than feeling like you're under time pressure to get that done. So if your children have grown up and moved across the country and you want to move to be closer to them, first off, have a conversation with them about it, because some people do like a little bit of distance, and it doesn't have to be, state lines, but you might not want to move next door as an example. And then just figure out what that will actually mean in terms of what you are doing being near your children, your grandchildren. If you're going to be providing ongoing babysitting, that's wonderful. But if you're just going to see them once a week for a dinner, that's an entirely different dynamic, and it might not suggest that you need to maybe pick up your life and move just to see them sporadically. If you're just going to continue to see them on holidays, you might be able to do that from where you are. And if you like living where you are, continue living where you are. So Christine then goes in and says, these are all fairly positive and uplifting things to consider, but you also think it's crucial to think through what you call the hard stuff, capital H, capital S, hard stuff. What kind of things fall under that heading? Maria says, these are the aspects of retirement that we don't necessarily look forward to, but they're worth thinking through in advance to take the emotions out of the decision-making. For example, what if something happens to you or your partner, either mentally or physically? The time to deal with this is in advance. There are financial implications, but also the emotional aspect. It's important to have a plan so that if something happens, the plan is activated rather than having to do the planning when things are stressful. I cannot second this enough. I think that this is kind of alluding to the importance of working with an expert in retirement. And the little note that I made to myself in the margin is cognitive decline. It's not something we really want to think about. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about what will happen when my cognition goes. I hope that I'm just blissfully unaware of the problems I might be causing. But if you have loved ones who are relying on your ability to, say, manage the assets, there was just a case recently in one of the financial publications. A man had worked a long career very diligently. He'd saved up $5 million for their retirement. And that is a lot of money to have in retirement. However, he systematically transferred all $5 million out to various crypto scams. And so the reason it was in the financial publication is this couple was trying to hold the bank accountable for processing the wires that this man was insisting they process. And working in the industry, I thought what was conspicuously absent from this article was any mention of a financial advisor working on their behalf. Because the person at the bank has a duty, they do, to their client, but it is so much lower than the fiduciary duty that a financial advisor has to a client. Efforts would have been made, strenuous efforts would have been made in order to prevent this person from making these decisions if they had been working with a person who has to have and act with their best interests in mind. So what she's saying is when you're thinking about the things that might go wrong in retirement, it's not necessarily a great way to spend your afternoon. However, it will allow you to get through these sort of hurdles without having to scramble at the last possible second. We've talked about this before on this podcast. A lot of people have the cognitive capacity to manage their own wealth well into retirement, even in their 80s and 90s. However, they're often not paired with a person with the same tastes or the same preferences. And if the money person were to pass away without having established a relationship with a person they trusted, they're leaving the surviving spouse to not only manage the whole estate process for the death of their loved one while grieving, but also to scramble and figure out, okay, now I'm in the driver's seat. I don't understand this stuff, not because I'm stupid, but because I've just never spent any time on it. And I don't want to have to figure this stuff out while providing a lifetime income from some volatile assets that I do not understand. Can put your loved one in a real hole there. So she goes on. She says there are also things you need to consider, like whether or not you want to age in place or whether you might move at some point. If you don't want to stay in your own home throughout retirement, is it accessible or conducive to aging? Do you need to make adjustments? Or do you want to take steps to move to a more age-friendly place, perhaps a continuing care community with lifestyle and healthcare amenities? We counsel our clients all the time. If you are considering moving to assisted living, make that decision before it is made for you. So don't have the reason you're moving to assisted living be because you broke your pelvis and now you can't get around. It's like if you feel as though you are not quite as confident on your feet anymore, if you feel like your balance isn't what it used to be, start considering these things so that you can make this decision proactively before some major health event makes the decision for you. And then think through what you want and then have this conversation with your loved ones. Take the step of writing down your wishes, share them with your family members so that they know your intentions, and make sure that you have all of those important estate planning documents in place, beneficiary designations, a living will, a power of attorney, and so on. Revisit those things over time. People frequently set up estate plans and then don't look at them for another 30 years. Meanwhile, the kids have grown and a lot of things have changed in their lives. They might have new grandkids or accumulated wealth and have new interests in charitable giving. Those things call for revisiting the estate plan. And again, this comes back to working with a team of experts. You want to have an estate plan that is periodically updated because things do change. Tax laws change. I mean, just the way that inherited IRAs are taxed, that significantly changed how people wanted their assets dispersed at their death because they recognized, hey, there's a real tax liability embedded in these accounts that used to have real tax advantages. Those are all things that you need to consider. And again, as you get older and as you're operating your life in retirement, you don't want to onboard all of these responsibilities. This makes sense to have a person who you trust looking over these things with you once a year and making sure everything is up to date. All right, the next heading is run the numbers. And this is where obviously Scott and I would get involved is because this is principally what we do. And so Christine says, the first big category, what you can control, is giving some thought to your retirement lifestyle. How are you going to spend your days? Where are you going to live? How about the financial piece? What steps should people take to feel like they're in control financially? Maria says, once you have your vision, run the numbers to see how achievable or realistic it is. You may need to make some trade-offs. Getting your arms around the different aspects of the financial plan will help you focus on what's important and will give you the confidence that you are financially equipped to withstand different scenarios like a market downturn or an unexpected costly home repair. And you might also have a positive surprise. As you are number crunching, you might find that you can afford that cruise your friends want you to join. Scott and I have talked about this before. Oftentimes, clients who have been very conservative in their savings throughout their life have delayed gratification, deferred gratification for a long time, come in with the assumption that they're going to have a bare bones budget, and that's all that's going to be able to be safely withdrawn from their plan, only to discover that they actually have the capacity to spend more than they had anticipated. That's not true for everyone. And unfortunately, it's probably more true for the very people who are more likely to seek out expert help than it is for those who are not. Not saying that everybody's going to have a positive surprise in retirement. You might get a result that says you need to work a little bit longer. It's not a death sentence, but you can't know unless you actually do this work. And I think clarifying what your plan can sustain is going to give you the confidence, or it's just going to give you the reassurance that you need to continue working or that you can safely retire. It's worth doing in either case. And so then she says, start the number crunching by looking at what's changing from an income standpoint. Is your paycheck stopping altogether? Are you planning to work part-time? Will you have a pension? Will you start taking Social Security? Many retirees need money to live on and can't or don't want to delay. This is when she's talking about Social Security. A lot of people are inclined to think, I paid into Social Security, so I want to take it as soon as I'm eligible. It's important to pause and run the numbers, though, because these decisions aren't all reversible. Very good point. And there can be a significant benefit to deferring Social Security benefits until 70. Now, we've done a little bit more of a deep dive on Social Security claiming strategies, Social Security optimization, net present value analysis of that. This is very idiosyncratic, and what I mean by that is it's going to have a lot to do with how long you expect to live, what your retirement lifestyle is going to be, if your spouse has her own benefits or credits or not, how much does Social Security account for your retirement budget, whether or not you really need to optimize leaving your surviving spouse the highest possible benefit. All of those things are something that you cannot get from a book like this. This is not going to have the answers for you. The answer here is work with somebody who can help you make the best decision subject to your own limitations and your own goals and all the rest of that. The next thing she says is to think about your expenses. If you're not sure how to estimate your expenses, a 75% income replacement is a common starting point. What that means is whatever it is that you were making just ahead of when you retired, you could probably live on close to 75% of that because some costs of working are going to fall away and you're not going to need to be saving anymore. So you're not going to be making, further allocations or investments in your 401k or your IRA. So 75% is a pretty good starting number. Again, very idiosyncratic, worth working with somebody to discover what that number actually is. And then as for spending guidelines, she said a starting withdrawal amount of 4% of your portfolio. It's a reasonable place to begin. And again, these are all just rules of thumb. These can be fleshed out in so much greater detail if you work with a person who can run various scenarios for you that, again, general advice, pretty good. But I think what her point here is working with experts that can help you with these decisions is always going to be superior than just using these heuristics or rules of thumb. Then she talks about taxes. Everybody loves that. She says, when you were working, taxes probably came out of your paycheck. But when you're retired, you need to think about them as an expense. Taxes may go down relative to what they were when you were working, but you may need to make quarterly estimates. Start running those numbers, income minus expenses, to get a sense of the cash flow. Also think about your net worth statement. What are your assets and liabilities? The tax question, the Social Security optimization question, the cash flow planning, all of that is extremely critical information that you're going to want to have before you've initiated your retirement. You want to get a sense of what the capacity of your assets is, subject to all the various fluctuations of the market. And this is just running, Monte Carlo analysis. That's not the extent of a financial plan, by the way. Monte Carlo is not a financial plan. But again, it gives you a good sense of what the capacity of your assets are so that you can get a good sense of what it is that you might be able to spend safely without running out of money. And that's really the ultimate risk, is sustaining a permanent loss from which you cannot recover. That's what you want to avoid in retirement. All right. The next subheading they go into, and I promise we're getting here close to the end, is control your costs. And so Christine says, Vanguard, which happens to be Maria's employer, has always been a low-cost provider. So I probably shouldn't be surprised to discover that you think costs are a key category that people can exert some control over. Let's talk about the different costs that we might incur and how we can try to control them. Now, from my experience working in this industry, everybody hears costs and they think investment costs. What are the expense ratios associated with the ETFs or mutual funds or whatever thing that I'm in? How much does it cost for me to own that? But I think costs are a much broader topic of discussion for your typical retiree because there are significant costs that you can incur, like Justin mentioned on the podcast when he was with us, from volatility. It's essentially making the wrong decision at the wrong time with respect to your assets, where you can miss out on a lot of market appreciation by having made the wrong decision at the wrong time. There are also tax costs. If you're extremely tax inefficient in how you've either invested your assets or how you're taking your income, you might be paying out way more in tax than you otherwise would if you had just made a slightly different set of decisions. So Maria says, often when we talk about cost, we focus on the cost of investing. Exactly. It's easy today to create a globally diversified portfolio at a low cost. ETFs are very low cost. Investments have been commoditized, and that's a good thing, but there are other costs to watch out for. So some of the costs that she highlights here are limiting tax costs. And so what she's saying is taxes in retirement are more complex because of the different account types. There are pre-tax accounts, both traditional tax-deferred IRAs as well as tax-deferred 401ks and 403bs and other company retirement plans. There are Roth accounts, IRAs and 401ks, which were introduced in the late 90s. We've seen a huge uptake in those. There are health savings accounts, and we're about to have a whole episode dedicated just to HSAs that's going to come out, I think, probably shortly before this one comes out. And these are another type of tax advantage savings vehicle. So we can now save in all these different kinds of accounts, and they're taxed differently, and they have different tax benefits on the front end and different tax benefits on the back end. It can be a little bit overwhelming to think through how to spend from these assets as tax efficiently as possible. And this is the work a financial planner should really be doing for you, is saying, well, you've accumulated assets in an HSA, an IRA, a Roth IRA, and your 401k. Now we need to turn those assets into a sustainable income. But it's not just a question of, well, let's just take it from this account today. It's a question of, well, hang on, how much tax are we going to pay today for a withdrawal versus how much tax might we pay later if we choose not to withdraw that money from that account? Why would we do it one way? And then how can we, and this is something that Scott really belabors with our clients, how can we keep your effective tax rate over your entire retirement as low as possible? And that often does not mean making your tax burden as low as possible this year. So kind of counterintuitive, but something that's very important to think about. She goes on. She says, many people might think that they're going to be in a lower tax bracket in retirement, but when RMDs commence, that's required minimum distributions, they often see a spike in taxes. This is significant because it can impact items that are tied to specific income thresholds, like the taxation of your Social Security benefits or Medicare Part B and Part D premiums. We've spoken at length about IRMAA before. And there are strategies considered before that point that can help smooth that liability. For example, required minimum distributions currently don't start until age 73, and that gives people a nice window between retirement and required minimum distributions when they might be in a lower tax bracket relative to where they will be in their working years and where they might be when RMDs commence. So what she's saying here is you're going to have a period of time, or most people are going to have a period of time in retirement where very detailed tax planning is possible. And what she's saying is once you've retired and no longer earning an income, and maybe even before you've taken Social Security and well ahead of when RMDs commence, you have the ability to essentially recognize income on your terms. So you are in full control of how much income and from which account you want to recognize in a given tax year, and that allows you to think about, when should I claim Social Security? What should I do? Should I entertain some Roth conversions or not? Should I use my HSA for certain things? These are all things that you need to consider so that you don't make irrevocable tax mistakes. So she goes on. She says, you might also want to make your life easier by consolidating accounts that you've accumulated over your years of working. Many people have IRAs at different financial institutions and a hodgepodge of different types of investments. So this might be an opportunity to do some organizational cleanup, some record keeping, and consolidation. Those things will make your life easier down the road. I could not agree more with this. And one of the things that people often forget is they regard their 401k and their IRA as essentially the same thing, but they are not. There are certain things that you can do with IRAs that you absolutely cannot do with 401ks and vice versa. Now, in retirement, one of the real advantages that IRAs have over 401ks, and this is not an explicit recommendation to roll your 401k plan over, I'm just giving you this information, is you can do what are called qualified charitable distributions only from IRAs. You cannot, as of the time of this recording, do a qualified charitable distribution from a 401k. Now, a qualified charitable distribution is the ability to give to charity directly from a tax-deferred account like an IRA, and it will never even hit your income. So it's not a deduction, it just never hits your gross income. That's only available in an IRA. Another thing that they do for required minimum distribution planning is you are allowed to do what's called aggregating your IRAs for required minimum distribution. Now, what that means is if you have 5 IRAs, the IRS really regards that as one big account. So they don't really care from which account you satisfy the required minimum distribution. They just want to make sure that it's paid. Not so with a 401k. So if you've worked at 3 separate employers and you have 3 outstanding 401k plans, each of those, when you hit age 73, will have its own mandatory distribution, and you will have to satisfy each one individually from those specific accounts. As you can imagine, if you are retired and you're traveling and you're sneaking up on the end of the year with the holidays, that might get a little bit difficult to administer. And the penalties for not distributing your required minimum distribution are severe. And those financial institutions where your 401k plans are held, these are often so large that they're not going to call you, they're not going to call you on New Year's Eve and say, hey, you haven't done your required minimum distribution. What are you doing? They're not going to do that. They might have sent you a letter or some kind of reminder in the mail, which gets mixed in with all the other mail and all the other stuff that you get. They're not going to proactively reach out to you. So her saying you might want to consolidate this is so that either you have some visibility on it or the person that you're working with has some visibility on it. All right. Christine says, you just said that this is a good spot to get some professional help. I agree. But I've met a lot of individual investors over the years who are determined to manage everything on their own, mainly because they want to limit their costs. How should people square the desire to get another set of eyes on their plans with the desire to limit costs? It's a very good question. When you get to the point of transitioning to retirement, this is Maria, ideally before you make the decision, it's a good time to get a second opinion on the financials. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of a qualm with that because she's saying right when your financial plan is about as complicated as it's ever going to get, that's when you should get some help. And I've made this joke before. I will make it again. I will make it again in the future. That strikes me a little bit as a recipe that instructs you to add flour after your cake has been baked. It's not going to taste very good. It is going to come out totally wrong. And so if you are just now considering retirement and you're thinking, dadgum, I should probably get some help with this, you might be a little bit late to the show. I would argue that establishing a relationship and developing a little bit of trust with a person ahead of when you need to make major irreversible decisions that have some major tax consequences, you want to have that relationship established well in advance of that. It's kind of like when I take my children to a pediatrician. I don't want to pay someone a one-off fee for a consultation unless it's a real emergency. I want a pediatrician who knows my children's baseline so that she will be able to detect some anomalies, maybe even before my wife and I do, because she knows how my kids behave and how they should be feeling and at what times they should be achieving certain milestones in their development. I don't have all of that information, and I certainly don't want a pediatrician to come in totally blind to their medical history and make a very big decision on behalf of my child. That's not the way that I want this to happen, and that's not the way that you want this to happen with your retirement. There are going to be some irreversible, irrevocable, very meaningful decisions you're going to need to make when you separate from service: pension commencement, NUA planning, distribution planning, rollover planning. All of this stuff is going to have to happen. And it's going to have to happen fairly quickly. I would probably want to know someone who I trusted that was going to help me with that well before I was making those decisions. So that's my little bit of a pushback there. And then Maria says, there are different types of advice. There's ongoing asset management. There's also one-time advice, maybe a fee-only advice model, point-in-time advice. Yes, you're paying that professional for their help, but they may save you money and taxes in the future. And they may make adjustments to your portfolio that could increase your overall wealth down the road. And if you want to give money to a family or friends or have charitable intentions, an advisor can make recommendations on how to do that effectively to maximize the value of your gifts. These are all really wonderful points. And that's the thing about costs is the cost that you pay for investment management. If you're working with an advisor and they charge you, let's say 1%, not saying that that's what we charge, but that's just a good round number. That is immediately made obvious to you. They have to disclose that to you regularly. However, the hidden costs of not working with not working with an expert are often never reported on, just like this person who lost $5 million to a crypto scam. If we include all of the people across the globe who have these sorts of things happen to them while not working with a financial advisor, those costs are often way more significant than the 1% that you would pay a person. And then the other thing that I like to bring up, one, because I think it's interesting, and two, because it could legitimately save someone's life when we're talking about costs, I like to think about how fast or the time it takes you to go 10 miles at various speeds in your car. Going 10 miles an hour takes you an hour. Going 20 miles an hour takes you a half hour. Going 30 miles an hour takes you 20 minutes. You can see, wow, if I just increase my speed a little bit, the gains are huge. And that's the way people view costs is if I just peel out a little bit more costs, there's some really big gains. But let's go further. Once you achieve 70 miles an hour and you're going 10 miles, at 70 miles an hour, you'll get there in 8.6 minutes. At 80 miles an hour, you'll get there in 7.5 minutes. And at 90 miles an hour, you'll get there in 6 minutes or 6.7 minutes. We're literally measuring the differences over that 10-mile stretch in seconds at that point. And here's the thing. At 80 and 90 miles an hour, the odds that you run your car off the road over that 10-mile stretch are much higher than at 60 and 50 miles an hour. And so if we included all the cars that ran off the road prematurely and how long it took them on average to achieve that 10-mile stretch, you might discover that 50 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour is actually the best way to travel on average than trying to just increase your speed to get there faster. And it's the same thing with costs. I'm not saying that you need to go out and find the most expensive financial advisor you can find, but some things are reassuringly expensive. And so I think working with an advisor can be on occasion reassuringly costly. Yes, you're paying an upfront fee. Yes, that fees should be disclosed to you. It should be transparent, all of those wonderful things. However, don't let it dissuade you from working with a person who knows what they're doing, because I like to think, and my bias is obvious here, that your decision-making is going to be incrementally better over time, and that the net savings from those better decisions you're going to make are going to totally wash out whatever it is that you're paying your advisor. So do what you will with that information. Make sure that you're pretty thorough in your hiring process, but keep the sort of hidden costs of going this alone in mind while you're making that decision. All right. So she says, having a professional look at your plan and give you some recommendations could be money well spent because they may be thinking about things that you may not be aware of, and they bring a level of objectivity to the planning that can be quite valuable. They may also be thinking about implications of various decisions down the road, particularly with respect to income tax and estate tax. A professional can also provide validation that your plan is on track, which will provide you valuable peace of mind. Really, what you're hiring a financial planner for are planning, error avoidance, and accountability. That's really what you want. You're not hiring them to outperform the S&P 500, which a lot of people think that's what they're doing. That's not what they're doing. They're there to do comprehensive financial planning, help you avoid major catastrophic errors, and accountability. So this is adherence to a plan. And the note that I made here was, if we think about the real progress that has been made in medicine, and this is coming from people like Peter Attia, it has been basically four things. The advent of vaccines and the discovery of penicillin, that has improved child mortality dramatically and increased life expectancy a lot. And that was like real science being done, studying how these things would be used, how they would be administered, and how it could help people. Incredible. However, a significant reason why people are living longer today than they previously were living is we are now getting doctors and nurses to regularly wash their hands between patients, and we are not smoking as much. So it's like a huge part of the increase in life expectancy has come from getting people to wash their hands. And Mr. Semmelweis, which is a story many of you might have heard, the physician that really discovered germ theory, he died in an insane asylum because he was so adamant about getting people to believe that you should, after working on cadavers, maybe not go and deliver a baby, which is, I kid you not, what physicians were doing at the time that he studied germ theory, where they were working on cadavers, delivering babies, the mothers would get a fever, and then they would die. So he thought, if you were just to rinse your hands in essentially like a bleach solution, that outcomes for the mothers and the babies were dramatically better. He died in an insane asylum because of this idea. And then cessation of smoking. Cessation of smoking, in terms of mortality from cancer-related deaths, that is the single best weapon that we've developed in perhaps the last 50 years since Richard Nixon declared a war on cancer. Smoking cessation has been number one in terms of reducing the incidence of lung cancer, which is a very fatal form. And so what I'm saying here is often simple solutions are just as valuable as complicated ones. So working with a person who can just point these things out, keep you accountable to your plan, extremely valuable. And they wrap this up with a little thing on being disciplined but not standing still. And the note that I made to myself here is it all adherence? Are the problems that we encounter in life mostly just at problems of adherence? Our inability to just develop a plan, stick with a plan, and be held accountable to that plan. They've studied this many times in the world of dieting. It tends not to matter which diet you follow. It just matters that you follow it. And what they've discovered is adherence is the best predictor of weight loss success rather than which diet it is that you've chosen to do. I would argue that the same thing is with financial planning. It doesn't really matter how you flesh out the various parts of your portfolio to a certain degree. It matters much more that you have a plan going into retirement and that you stick to that plan. And so Maria says on the flexibility side, remember, retirement planning is not one size fits all. It's a very personal journey. And what you do with your retirement is up to you. Don't try to keep up with the Joneses. As long as you're happy and you feel fulfilled, that's fine, and have fun with it. And I think that is a great place to close because I don't think there's anything more important than feeling as if you're entering retirement with the ability to have a very satisfying life. And that is really the point. That's the whole point of what we're doing here, is we want to give you information that will allow you to live a more enriched and more satisfying life by helping you get your finances in order. So from Maria, develop a plan, stick with that plan, work with a person who's going to hold you accountable to that plan, and really focus most of your efforts, if not all, only on those things that you can actually exert some control over in retirement, and that will allow you to be much happier and much more fulfilled. Stay tuned for our next installment. Wherever you're listening to this, like the episode, subscribe, and see y'all next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Personal Finance Project. This show would not exist without the help of our brilliant creative director, Kira Minifield. Kira, thank you for everything you do to keep this show running. On to the disclosures. This broadcast contains the current opinions of the hosts and are subject to change. The broadcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice or recommendations. Investors should obtain professional advice before making investment decisions. This is not a complete analysis of every material fact regarding any company, industry, or security. The information has been obtained from sources we consider to be reliable but cannot guarantee their accuracy. Robert W. Baird & Co. Incorporated is not a legal or tax services provider, and you are strongly encouraged to seek the advice of the appropriate professional advisors before taking any action. For more information about any companies discussed, please contact Baird. Past performance is not indicative of future results, and diversification does not ensure a profit or protect against loss. All investments carry some level of risk, including loss of principal. An investment cannot be made directly in an index. Investors should consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses of a fund carefully before investing. This and other information is found in the prospectus and summary prospectus. For a prospectus, please contact your financial professional and read it carefully before investing. Annuities carry unique risks, including market risk, investment risk, and claims-paying abilities of the insurer. There may also be instances where a contract will pay out less than the premiums paid or expire within the lifetime of the insured. There may be penalties for early withdrawal, and they are not insured by the FDIC because they are insurance, not an investment. Investors should consider carefully information contained in the prospectus or, if available, the summary prospectus, including investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. You can request a prospectus by reaching out to your financial advisor. Please read the prospectus carefully before investing. Investment returns will fluctuate and are subject to market volatility, so that an investor's shares, when redeemed or sold, may be worth more or less than their original cost. Unlike mutual funds, shares of ETFs are not individually redeemable directly with the ETF. Shares of ETFs are bought and sold at market price, which may be higher or lower than the net asset value, NAV. Baird does not issue or underwrite mortgages and does not service mortgage lending services. Any references to mortgages in the financial services offerings are purely intended to convey an engagement in this holistic planning process, with this as one piece of the larger picture, which may or may not apply to all clients. This broadcast may not be reproduced without express permission of Robert W. Baird & Co., Incorporated.